Billionaire makes shocking decision. After seeing little girl at his late wife's grave. Before the story begins, drop a comment below and share where you're watching us from. The morning fog hung like a specter over Oakwood Cemetery, wrapping the gravestones in a ghostly embrace. Richard Blackwood stood motionless before a marble headstone, his tall figure cutting a solitary silhouette against the gray landscape. His expensive charcoal suit and perfectly groomed appearance contrasted sharply with the raw emotion in his eyes as he stared at the engraved name. Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, beloved wife, 10 years. A decade since he'd held her hand as she took her final breath. A decade of building his empire higher and wider as if steel and glass could fill the void she left behind. "I made another billion this year, Sarah," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Blackwood Technologies just launched the neural interface you always said would change everything. You were right. As usual." The autumn wind carried the scent of approaching rain, but Richard remained unmoved. At 45, he had achieved everything society deemed important: wealth, power, influence. Forbes had named him most innovative CEO 3 years running. His face had graced countless magazine covers. Yet standing here, none of it seemed to matter. His watch, a timepiece worth more than what most people earned in a year, showed 8:17 a.m. In exactly 13 minutes, his driver would bring the car around, and by 9 hours, he would be chairing a meeting that would determine the future of technology for the next decade. Every moment of his life ran with precision, a meticulously maintained schedule that left no room for deviation or, more importantly, reflection. A sound disturbed the silence, so faint he almost missed it, a child's voice carrying on the wind. "I brought you yellow ones today. Remember how you said they're like tiny suns you can hold in your hand?" Richard turned, irritated at having his solitude interrupted. Several rows away, a small figure knelt before a simple granite marker. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, was carefully arranging wildflowers on a grave. Her red coat was too thin for the October chill, and her dark hair hung in a messy braid down her back. Mrs. Patterson at school said, "I have to improve my reading. But it's hard without you helping me," the child continued, apparently speaking to the grave. "I tried really hard, though. Grandma says you'd be proud." Something about the scene made Richard's chest tighten. The girl's profile, serious and solemn as she carefully arranged her flowers, evoked a strange familiarity that he couldn't place. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly on the surrounding stone. The girl glanced up at the sky but made no move to leave. Instead, she simply pulled her inadequate coat tighter around her small frame and continued her one-sided conversation. "I should go soon. Grandma doesn't know I came here before school. She works really hard, but she's always tired and coughing a lot. I try to help, but..." Richard checked his watch again. 8:22. His driver would be waiting. The meeting couldn't start without him, but Marcus Hayes, his potential Japanese investors, would be irritated by any delay. Billions rode on this meeting. Rain intensified, and Richard turned to leave, taking 2 steps toward the cemetery gates before stopping. The girl was still there, her small shoulders now hunched against the rain, her coat beginning to darken with moisture. She seemed determined to finish whatever ritual she had started, regardless of the weather. Something inside Richard, something long dormant, stirred uncomfortably. He had built his empire on calculated decisions, on never deviating from the optimal path. His board of directors often remarked that Richard Blackwood didn't make emotional decisions, yet his feet moved of their own accord, leading him away from the path to his waiting car and toward the kneeling child. By the time he reached her, rain was falling steadily, plastering her hair to her head. "You should get out of the rain," he said, his voice coming out more gruffly than intended. The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber, wide with surprise and a wariness that seemed too mature for her young face. For a moment she just stared at him, as if trying to determine his intentions. "I'm almost done," she finally said. turning back to the grave. I need to finish telling her about my week. Richard found himself at a loss for words. He stood awkwardly, rain soaking through his Italian wool suit, as the girl continued to speak softly to the headstone. Jessica Lynn Reynolds, beloved daughter and mother. The dates showed she had died just over a year ago. Listen, he tried again. I have an umbrella in my car. Let me at least drive you somewhere dry. Where's your grandmother? The girl considered him for a long moment, her amber eyes seeming to look straight through his carefully constructed facade. It was unsettling. Grandma's at home. She's not feeling well today. She hesitated, then added, She doesn't know I came here. You shouldn't be out alone, Richard said, surprised by the concern in his voice. It's not safe. A strange expression crossed the girl's face, something between amusement and sadness. Nothing bad ever happens at Mom's grave, she said with the absolute certainty of childhood. She watches over me. The rain was coming down harder now, and Richard made a decision. He shrugged off his expensive suit jacket and held it over the child's head. I'm Richard, he said, crouching down to her level. What's your name? Emma, she replied, still watching him with those unsettling amber eyes. Emma Reynolds. Well, Emma Reynolds, I think your mother would understand if you finished your visit another day. She wouldn't want you catching pneumonia. Emma seemed to consider this logic, then nodded slowly. She reached out to touch the headstone one last time, a gesture so tender it made Richard's throat tighten unexpectedly. Bye, Mom, she whispered. I'll come back when it's sunny. As she stood, Richard noticed how truly inadequate her coat was, thin, too small, and patched in several places. He kept his jacket held over her as they walked toward the cemetery gates, the girl maintaining a careful distance from him despite the shelter he offered. Where do you live, Emma? I'll have my driver take you home. Pinewood Gardens, she answered, after a moment's hesitation. Building C. Richard knew the area, a rundown housing complex on the outskirts of the city, about as far from his penthouse as one could get while still being in city limits. His driver, James, raised a questioning eyebrow when Richard appeared with a soaking wet child in tow, but was too professional to comment. Change of plans, Richard announced, opening the rear door of the black Bentley. We're taking Miss Reynolds home first. Emma hesitated before the open car door, her eyes widening at the leather interior. Your car is nicer than Principal Warner's, and he said his was the fanciest in the whole town. Despite himself, Richard felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. It's just a car, he said, though both of them knew it was much more than that. As Emma settled into the back seat, her small hand clutching the edge of the leather cautiously, as if afraid to fully touch it, Richard's phone began buzzing incessantly. His assistant, multiple board members, the Japanese investors, everyone demanding to know where he was. Pinewood Gardens, Building C, he instructed James, ignoring the phone. He could feel a strange sensation blooming in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. It felt suspiciously like purpose. Emma looked up at him from beneath wet lashes. Are you in trouble now because of me? Richard considered the question, aware that his entire meticulously scheduled life had just veered off course because of this chance encounter. The Richard Blackwood of yesterday would have considered it an inconvenience, a deviation to be corrected. But something about this small, solemn girl speaking to her mother's grave had triggered something long buried inside him. As the car pulled away from the cemetery, Richard Blackwood made the first spontaneous decision he'd made in a decade. No, Emma, he said, surprising himself with his certainty. I don't believe I am. Little did he know that this rainy morning encounter was far from random, and that the amber-eyed child sitting beside him would soon turn his carefully ordered world completely upside down. The sleek Bentley looked jarringly out of place as it pulled up to Pinewood Gardens. Emma directed them to a faded blue door on the ground floor of Building C. That's our apartment, she said, gathering Richard's still damp jacket that had somehow ended up wrapped around her shoulders. I should speak with your grandmother, Richard insisted, ignoring another call from his assistant. Emma led him to the door, knocked tentatively, and called out, "Grandma, it's me." The door opened to reveal an elderly woman, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She took in Emma's wet appearance with alarm, then froze when her gaze shifted to Richard. "Mr. Blackwood?" she gasped, clutching the doorframe for support. Richard stared at the woman, confusion creasing his brow until recognition dawned. "Charlotte Reynolds?" Emma looked between them. "You know each other?" Charlotte nodded slowly. "I was your wife's nurse, Mr. Blackwood, during her final months." The world seemed to tilt beneath Richard's feet. Of course, Charlotte had been Sarah's home hospice nurse when the cancer had progressed too far for hospital care, the kind-faced woman who had helped ease Sarah's pain, who had been there on that final day when Richard's world had collapsed. "Please come in," Charlotte said, ushering them inside. The apartment was small but impeccably clean. What the space lacked in luxury, it made up for in warmth. Handmade quilts, framed children's artwork, and well-worn furniture that invited you to sit. "Emma, go change into dry clothes," Charlotte instructed. When the girl disappeared down the hallway, Charlotte turned to Richard. "I never expected to see you again." "I didn't recognize you," he admitted. "It's been 10 years. "And you haven't changed a bit," she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. His hair might be the same, his posture equally rigid, but something fundamental had shifted in Richard Blackwood over the past decade. "I found Emma at the cemetery," he explained, "at her mother's grave." Charlotte's expression softened with sorrow. "My daughter, Jessica. We lost her last year in a car accident." As Charlotte made tea in the tiny kitchen, Richard noticed a familiar photograph on the wall. Sarah in her hospital bed, smiling weakly, with Charlotte beside her. His heart contracted painfully. "Sarah spoke of you often, you know," Charlotte said, handing him a chipped mug. "Even at the end." Before Richard could respond, Emma returned wearing dry clothes, carrying a drawing pad. "I made this for you," she said, shyly offering him a page. The drawing showed 3 figures: a tall man, in a suit, a small girl, and an older woman, all holding hands beside a grave covered in yellow flowers. "That's us," Emma explained unnecessarily. "At my mom's grave. And you didn't even get mad about your fancy jacket getting wet." Richard stared at the childish drawing, feeling something crack inside him, something that had been frozen solid for 10 years. "Thank you, Emma," he managed, his voice uncharacteristically rough. As he prepared to leave, Charlotte walked him to the door. "Emma has your wife's eyes," she said quietly. "I noticed it the first time I held her as a baby. The same remarkable amber." Richard stepped back into the waiting Bentley, instructing James to take him to the office. But as the car pulled away, he found himself looking back at the small blue door, feeling as though he'd left something important behind. Richard's mind was elsewhere during the rescheduled meeting with the Japanese investors. While his mouth formed words about market projections and neural interfaces, his thoughts kept returning to Emma's amber eyes and Charlotte's revelation. Those eyes. Sarah's eyes. Mr. Blackwood? Marcus Hayes, his VP of Operations, was staring at him expectantly. "I apologize," Richard said, straightening in his chair. "Please continue." Later that evening, alone in his penthouse overlooking the city, Richard opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a small velvet box containing Sarah's wedding ring and a photograph. Sarah at the beach, laughing into the camera, her amber eyes catching the sunlight. The same eyes that had looked up at him from beneath wet lashes in the cemetery. 3 days later, Richard found himself back at Pinewood Gardens, a leather portfolio under his arm. He'd had his team investigate Charlotte and Emma's situation. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Charlotte answered the door, surprise evident on her tired face. "Mr. Blackwood, this is unexpected." "Please call me Richard," he said, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. "May I come in?" Emma was at school, Charlotte explained as she served tea in the same chipped mugs. Richard came straight to the point. "I'd like to help you and Emma," he said, opening his portfolio. I've prepared some options. Financial assistance, a college, fund for Emma, perhaps a more suitable apartment. Charlotte's expression shifted, a gentle but unmistakable pride straightening her shoulders. That's very generous, but we don't need charity. It's not charity, Richard insisted. Consider it delayed compensation for the exceptional care you provided Sarah. Charlotte studied him, her gaze penetrating. Is that really why you're here, Mr. Blackwood? Or is it those eyes of hers that brought you back? Richard sat back momentarily speechless. Charlotte had seen right through his rationalization. Sarah always said you hid your heart away, Charlotte continued, even before she got sick. She worried what would happen to that heart after she was gone. The front door opened before Richard could respond, and Emma burst in, her school backpack bouncing against her small frame. Mr. Blackwood, she exclaimed, genuinely delighted. Did you come to see our home? I told Madison at school about your car, but she didn't believe me. Hello, Emma, Richard said, feeling that strange warmth again. How was school? We learned about butterflies. They start as something ugly and turn into something beautiful, she announced, dropping her backpack to rummage through it. Look, I drew one for you. Richard accepted the crayon drawing, oddly touched. It's excellent. The detail in the wings is impressive. Emma beamed, then asked with childlike directness, Are you going to be our friend now? The question hung in the air. Charlotte watched him carefully, and Richard realized he was at a crossroads. He could write a check, ease his conscience, and return to his ordered existence. Or he could do something far more terrifying. I'd like that very much, he heard himself say. As he left the apartment, Charlotte followed him into the hallway. Emma needs stability, not fleeting interest, she warned softly. If you come into her life, she'll count on you being there. Richard nodded, understanding the weight of what he was committing to. I know. As the Bentley pulled away, his phone rang. It was Marcus, panic evident in his voice. The board's called an emergency meeting. They're questioning your commitment after you missed the Japanese meeting. Richard gazed back at Building C, thinking of the small blue door and what lay beyond. Kit, tell them I'll be there, he said. And Marcus? Clear my schedule for Sunday afternoons from now on. He had a standing appointment to keep with a little girl with amber eyes. Chapter 4. The Abandoned Place. Richard stood before the wrought iron gates of the Blackwood country estate, keys dangling from his fingers. Vines crawled up the stone pillars, and the once manicured gardens had surrendered to wilderness. He hadn't been here since Sarah's death. Sir, shall I wait? James asked from the Bentley. No, Richard replied. This might take a while. The key turned with resistance in the lock. Inside, furniture sat draped in white sheets like ghosts, dust particles dancing in the shafts of light that broke through the closed curtains. The air smelled of abandonment and faded memories. Richard moved through the house with reverence, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Every corner held Sarah's touch, the antique desk where she wrote letters, the window seat where she read during rainstorms, the kitchen where she insisted on cooking Sunday breakfast herself. No staff allowed. He climbed the stairs to Sarah's study, a room he'd avoided even before her death as it became her sanctuary during her illness. The door creaked open to reveal walls lined with books and a large oak desk facing the window overlooking what had once been her rose garden. Richard approached the desk hesitantly. Her things remained exactly as she'd left them. A half-finished cup of tea now dried to dust, notebooks stacked neatly, a fountain pen placed precisely parallel to the edge. He opened the top drawer and found what he'd come for. Sarah's journal, bound in soft leather. His fingers trembled as he lifted it out. She'd written in it daily, even in her final weeks when holding the pen became difficult. Richard sat in her chair and opened the journal to its final entries. October 15th. Charlotte brought photos of her granddaughter today. Her eyes remind me of mine. Richard would have loved a child with those eyes. Richard's breath caught. He turned to the next page. October 18th. Told Richard about the foundation, today. He promised to make it happen. I believe him, but worry once I'm gone, he'll retreat further into his work. The foundation would help so many children like little Emma. Richard stared at the name on the page. Emma, Charlotte's granddaughter. The coincidence seemed impossible. He read on, finding Sarah's detailed plans for a children's foundation, a place for children dealing with loss, where they could heal through art, music, and community. It was a dream she'd shared with him, and he'd promised to fulfill it. A promise he'd buried along with her. In the back of the journal, he found a photograph he'd never seen. Sarah with Charlotte and a young woman who must have been Jessica, Emma's mother. Sarah's hand rested protectively on Jessica's very pregnant belly, the date stamp on the back, 2 weeks before Sarah died. Richard closed the journal, overwhelmed. The foundation he'd never built, the promise he'd never kept, the connections between Sarah, Charlotte, and Emma that seemed too significant to be coincidental. As he rose to leave, a thought struck him. If Sarah had died while Jessica was still pregnant with Emma, how had Charlotte known Emma had Sarah's eyes when she was a baby? Back in the Bentley, Richard made a decision. James, take me to Blackwood Tower. At his office, Richard summoned his architects and legal team. For hours, they worked through preliminary plans and paperwork. By evening, he had the beginnings of a proposal. A community center for children experiencing loss, to be built on land the company already owned, near Pinewood Gardens. As he stared at the plans spread across his desk, his phone rang. It was Charlotte. Emma's been asking when you'll visit again, she said, her voice revealing both hope and caution. She's drawn more butterflies for you. Richard looked at Sarah's journal beside the architect's renderings. Actually, he said, I have something I'd like to discuss with both of you. Something important. As he hung up, Richard gazed at the photograph of Sarah, Charlotte, and Jessica. For the first time in 10 years, he felt something long dormant stirring inside him. Purpose. And perhaps redemption. Emma's face lit up when Richard arrived at their apartment, clutching her butterfly drawings as if they were precious gems. You came back. I promised I would, Richard replied, surprised by how much her delight affected him. Charlotte observed their interaction with cautious optimism. After Emma proudly displayed her artwork, Charlotte suggested she work on homework in her room. I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood privately. Once Emma disappeared down the hallway, Richard opened his leather portfolio on the coffee table. I've been thinking about our conversation, he began, unfolding architectural renderings, and about a promise I made to Sarah before she died. Charlotte leaned forward, studying the blueprints with a puzzled expression. What am I looking at? The Sarah Blackwood Community Center for Children, Richard explained, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. A place for children experiencing loss to find healing through art, community, and support. He outlined his vision, a modern facility with art studios, counseling rooms, communal spaces, and gardens. Sarah planned it all before she died. I promised to build it, but after she was gone. He trailed off, the admission of his failure hanging between them. Charlotte touched the blueprints gently. This is what she talked about during those final weeks. Her legacy project, she called it. Richard nodded. I found her journal at our country house. Her plans were remarkably detailed. He hesitated before continuing. Charlotte, I'd like you to run it. Her head snapped up. Me? You have nursing experience, compassion, and first-hand understanding of loss. The position comes with a substantial salary, benefits, and flexibility to accommodate Emma's needs. Charlotte's expression remained skeptical. And why now, after 10 years? Richard considered deflecting, but opted for honesty. Meeting Emma awakened something I've kept buried. When I saw her in the cemetery, talking to her mother's grave. He paused, gathering himself. It was like seeing myself 10 years ago, except she still has hope in her eyes. Charlotte studied him intently. This isn't charity? It's a job offer, Richard clarified. You'd report to the board like any director. The center would be independently funded but associated with my company's philanthropic division. Before Charlotte could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, homework forgotten. "Are those house pictures?" she asked, eyeing the blueprints with curiosity. Richard exchanged a glance with Charlotte, who nodded permission. "It's a special place I'm planning to build," he explained as Emma climbed onto the sofa between them. "A place for children who've lost someone they love." Emma traced the outlines with her small finger. "Like me?" "Yes," Richard said gently. "Exactly like you." "And I'd be working there," Charlotte added cautiously. "If I decide to accept Mr. Blackwood's offer." Emma's eyes widened. "Would I get to go there after school, instead of Mrs. Peterson's?" Charlotte smiled. "That would be the idea." Emma examined the blueprint seriously, then looked up at Richard. "Does it have a garden? Mom loved gardens." "It will now," Richard promised, making a mental note. Emma nodded approvingly, then delivered her verdict. "I think you should say yes, Grandma." Charlotte laughed softly. "It's not quite that simple, sweetheart." "Why not?" Emma asked with a child's straightforward logic. "Mr. Blackwood is nice, and you always say we should help other people who are sad." The simple wisdom left both adults momentarily speechless. Charlotte finally sighed. "I'll consider it, Richard. Truly. But I need time." "Of course," he agreed, gathering his materials. As he prepared to leave, Emma pressed her butterfly drawings into his hands. "These are for your office," she declared, "so you don't forget about us." Richard carefully tucked them into his portfolio. "I couldn't forget if I tried, Emma." Walking back to his car, Richard realized that for the first time in a decade, he felt truly alive, terrified, uncertain, but undeniably alive. The board, members of Blackwood Technologies, stared in stunned silence at the images on the conference room screen. Richard Blackwood, the same man who once fired an executive for being 3 minutes late to a meeting, stood in jeans and a work shirt, his sleeves rolled up, painting a wall. "As you can see," Richard continued, unfazed by their shock, "renovation of the Sarah Blackwood Community Center is ahead of schedule. Will open in 6 weeks, barring any major setbacks." Marcus Hayes found his voice first. "Richard, while we admire the personal involvement, is this the best use of your time? The neural interface launch is 8 weeks away." "I'm fully briefed on the launch," Richard replied calmly. "The community center takes only my Sunday afternoons and occasional evenings." After the meeting adjourned, Marcus lingered behind. "Permission to speak freely?" Richard nodded, collecting his notes. "What's really going on? First you missed the Japanese investors, then you launched this community center out of nowhere, and now you're painting walls like a common laborer." Marcus's concern was genuine. "The board is worried." Richard considered his response carefully. "Do you remember what Sarah used to say about legacy, Marcus? That true legacy isn't what you build, but who you help along the way," Marcus quoted softly. "Exactly. For 10 years, I've focused exclusively on the what. It's time I balanced the equation." Later that afternoon, Richard arrived at the construction site of the community center. What had been an abandoned warehouse 3 weeks ago was rapidly transforming. Workers moved efficiently through the space, erecting walls, installing wiring, and preparing plumbing. Charlotte had accepted his offer, though not without establishing clear boundaries. She insisted on maintaining her independence, refusing Richard's offer to relocate to a better apartment until she earned enough to afford it herself. "Mr. Blackwood," Emma's voice rang out across the site. She wore a child-sized hard hat and a paint-splattered apron, waving enthusiastically from a corner where she and Charlotte were organizing art supplies. Richard made his way over, nodding, to workers who had initially been intimidated by him but now offered friendly greetings. "We're painting the mural wall today," Emma announced, pointing to a large blank wall. "Miss Abigail said I could help design it." Abigail Chen, the art therapist Richard had hired on Charlotte's recommendation, smiled warmly. "Emma has quite the eye for color." "Is that so?" Richard asked, genuinely interested. "Come see." Emma grabbed his hand without hesitation, a gesture that still surprised him, and pulled him toward a table covered with sketches. I think we should have a big tree and butterflies. Lots of butterflies. And maybe the sky should change colors, like a rainbow but softer. Richard examined her, drawings with appropriate seriousness. These are excellent ideas, very professional. Emma beamed at the praise. Want to help? I can teach you. Before he could respond, Charlotte approached, clipboard in hand. Emma, let Mr. Blackwood breathe. He probably has important meetings to get to. Actually, Richard said, checking his watch, my schedule is clear until tomorrow morning. Emma's face lit up. Then you can stay. I'll show you how to paint butterflies. For the next 3 hours, Richard Blackwood, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, sat cross-legged on the floor with Emma learning to paint butterflies. His technique was precise but lacked creativity, a fact Emma pointed out with brutal honesty. You're making them all the same, she observed, her nose wrinkling. Butterflies aren't supposed to match exactly. That's what makes them special. Richard studied his row of identical blue butterflies. You're right. What would you suggest? Close your eyes and feel the colors, Emma instructed seriously. That's what Mom used to say. Don't think about it so much. Charlotte, watching from across the room, couldn't suppress a smile at the sight of Richard Blackwood obediently closing his eyes, paintbrush in hand, being instructed by a 6-year-old. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Charlotte brought Richard a cup of coffee. He sat back on his heels, surveying their progress. The mural was taking shape, a whimsical landscape with an enormous tree, countless butterflies of varying shapes and colors, and a sky that transitioned from dawn to dusk. She's good for you, Charlotte observed quietly, nodding toward Emma, who was carefully washing brushes with Abigail. I'm beginning to think Sarah orchestrated this somehow, Richard admitted, accepting the coffee. Finding Emma at the cemetery that day, it feels like more than coincidence. Charlotte's expression softened. Sarah always did play the long game. As Richard prepared to leave, Emma presented him with a small canvas. On it was a remarkably detailed butterfly, its wings a vibrant amber, the exact shade of her eyes. This one's special, she explained, for your office. So when people ask what it is, you can tell them about our center. Richard carefully placed the canvas in his car, handling it with more reverence than he showed the rare antiquities in his penthouse. On the drive home, he realized his hands were stained with paint, his expensive watch speckled with blue and purple dots. For the first time in memory, he didn't care about the imperfection. His phone chimed with a message from Charlotte. Emma says your butterflies need work, but she's willing to give you another lesson next Sunday. Richard found himself smiling as he typed his reply. I'll bring better snacks this time. The next morning, his executive assistant did a double take when Richard arrived with paint still embedded in his cuticles and a small canvas, butterfly prominently displayed on his desk. Richard stared at the numbers on his tablet, but they failed to hold his attention. Outside his floor-to-ceiling office windows, the city sprawled below, a landscape of steel and glass he'd helped shape. Yet his mind kept drifting to a partially painted mural and a little girl's laughter. Sir? His assistant, Diane, appeared at the door. The quarterly reports are ready for your review, and Mr. Hayes is asking about the Neuromatrix presentation for tomorrow's investors' call. Thank you, Diane. Could you also order a collection of children's art supplies? High quality, professional grade if possible. If Diane was surprised by the request, her professional demeanor betrayed nothing. Any specific items, sir? Watercolors, acrylics, quality brushes. He hesitated, realizing he was out of his depth. Actually, I'll send you a list from Ms. Chen at the community center. As Diane departed, Richard noticed Marcus hovering in the doorway. Concern etched across his features. Come in, Marcus, Richard sighed. I can practically hear you thinking. Marcus closed the door behind him. The board is questioning your focus, Richard. Henderson specifically mentioned you left yesterday's budget meeting early to, and I quote, paint butterflies with orphans. Emma is not an orphan, Richard corrected sharply. And Henderson should focus more on our declining market share in Asia than my personal schedule. Marcus approached the desk, his voice lowering. Richard, we've worked together for 15 years. I've never seen you like this. The community, center this girl and her grandmother. It's changing you. Is that a bad thing? No, Marcus admitted. Actually, you seem more human, but others are interpreting it as weakness, distraction. The vultures are circling. Richard considered this. The corporate world was indeed cutthroat, a reality he'd not only accepted but exploited throughout his career. He'd built his reputation on being ruthlessly focused, emotionally detached, and consistently victorious. Let them circle, he finally said. The neural interface launch will quiet them down. Marcus didn't seem convinced. And if it doesn't? Richard's eyes drifted to Emma's butterfly canvas. Then perhaps it's time for Blackwood Technologies to evolve, just as its CEO is evolving. That evening, instead of working late as was his custom, Richard left the office at 6 and directed James to drive him to Pinewood Gardens. He'd called ahead and Charlotte had invited him for dinner, a simple gesture that nevertheless felt monumental. Emma answered the door, her face lighting up. You're here. I told Grandma you'd come exactly at 6 because you're always on time. The apartment smelled of home cooking, a scent so foreign yet achingly familiar that Richard paused in the doorway, momentarily transported to childhood memories of his mother's kitchen before she'd left. It's just chicken and vegetables, Charlotte said, misinterpreting his hesitation. Nothing fancy. It smells wonderful, Richard assured her, presenting a small gift bag to Emma. I brought something for our art lessons. Emma peeked inside and gasped theatrically. Real artist brushes like Miss Abigail uses. She threw her arms around Richard's waist in a spontaneous hug that left him momentarily frozen before he awkwardly patted her back. Dinner was a revelation. The three of them around the small table, Emma chattering about school, Charlotte sharing stories from her nursing days, and Richard finding himself talking about Sarah in a way he hadn't in years. Not with grief, but with fondness and even occasional laughter. She once replaced all my dress socks with identical ones in bright purple, he recalled, smiling at the memory. Said if I was going to be so predictable in my wardrobe, I should at least have colorful feet. After dinner, while Charlotte cleaned up despite Richard's offers to help, Emma showed him her school project, a family tree. See, here's me and Grandma and Mom up in heaven, she explained, pointing to the crayon figures. But I don't know what to put on this side. She indicated the paternal branch, conspicuously empty. What about your father? Richard asked carefully. Emma shrugged. Mom said he wasn't ready to be a dad. Grandma says sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt other people, even when they don't mean to. The wisdom in Charlotte's explanation struck Richard deeply. How many choices had he made that hurt others, all in pursuit of his own agenda? Emma, Charlotte called from the kitchen. Time to get ready for bed. After Emma reluctantly departed, Richard helped Charlotte with the dishes, an activity so domestic he couldn't recall the last time he'd engaged in it. Thank you for including me tonight, he said quietly. Charlotte studied him. You know, when Sarah was sick, she worried about you more than herself. She said you'd build walls so high no one would be able to reach you. Richard concentrated on drying a plate. She wasn't wrong. No, but she also believed someone would come along who could scale those walls. Charlotte smiled sadly. I think she'd be pleased it was a 6-year-old with paint-stained fingers. Later, as James drove him back to his penthouse, Richard received a text from Henderson. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Topic: leadership concerns. Richard closed the message without responding. For the first time in his career, a corporate threat didn't fill him with strategic fury. Instead, he found himself thinking of Emma's family tree, with its empty spaces waiting to be filled. James, he said suddenly, change of plans for tomorrow. I'll need you to pick me up at 7 a.m., then collect Emma and Charlotte at 7:30. Sir? The board wants to discuss leadership, Richard replied, a new resolve forming. I think it's time they see exactly what leadership looks like. The evening air held the first real chill of autumn as Richard stood on the rooftop garden of the nearly completed community center. Below him, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, while above, the real ones struggled to shine through urban light pollution. In 5 days, the Sarah Blackwood Community Center would officially open. Earlier that morning, the board meeting had been unexpected. Instead of defending himself, Richard had brought Emma, Charlotte, and the entire community center team to Blackwood Tower. He'd given the board a presentation they hadn't anticipated, not about profit margins or market share, but about legacy, community impact, and the neural interface technology's potential applications for children with trauma. Emma had stolen the show, confidently explaining to a room full of stern executives how art helped her feel less sad about Mom being in heaven. By the end, even Henderson had softened, awkwardly accepting Emma's gift of a hand-painted butterfly pin for his lapel. "There you are." Charlotte's voice interrupted his thoughts as she stepped onto the rooftop. "Emma's helping Ms. Chen arrange the art room. That child has opinions about everything." Richard smiled. "She comes by it honestly." Charlotte joined him at the railing, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the evening breeze. "Tomorrow's the final inspection. Nervous?" "Strangely, no," Richard admitted. "The neural interface launch next month has billions riding on it, yet I'm more invested in this center being perfect." Charlotte studied him with that penetrating gaze that always made Richard feel transparent. "It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to help children heal." Richard nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. After a comfortable silence, he said, "I've been thinking about setting up a scholarship fund in Sarah's name for the children here, something to help with college when the time comes." "That's a wonderful idea," Charlotte agreed. Then, more hesitantly, "Richard, there's something I should tell you. I'm not sure I'm the right person to run this center." Richard turned to face her fully. "What do you mean? You're perfect for this role." Charlotte's hands fidgeted with her cardigan. "I'm 67 years old. My energy isn't what it used to be, and sometimes—" She paused. "Sometimes I get so tired I can barely climb the stairs to our apartment." Concern furrowed Richard's brow. "Have you seen a doctor?" "I can't afford the specialist copays," she admitted, "and I've been putting it off because of Emma. She's already lost so much." Before Richard could respond, the rooftop door burst open, and Emma bounded through, her face alight with excitement. "Grandma, Mr. Richard, come see what we did in the art room. We arranged all the supplies by color instead of type because it looks prettier that way, and Miss Chen said it's more creative." She pronounced the word carefully, clearly proud of this new addition to her vocabulary. "We'll be right there, sweetheart," Charlotte assured her with a smile that masked her previous concern. As Emma disappeared back through the door, Richard placed a gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "First thing tomorrow, I'm having my personal physician see you. No arguments," he added when she began to protest. "Consider it a workplace benefit." Charlotte sighed but nodded. "Emma can't lose another person, Richard." "She won't," he promised, though they both knew it wasn't a promise anyone could truly keep. They found Emma in the art room, proudly showing Ms. Chen how to organize paintbrushes by size. The room was a riot of color, with student artwork already adorning the walls and supplies meticulously arranged on open shelving. "What do you think?" Emma demanded, spinning in a circle with her arms outstretched. "Isn't it the most beautiful room ever?" Richard took in the space, not with the critical eye of a CEO evaluating an investment, but through the perspective Emma had given him. The joy in the colors, the potential in each blank canvas, the healing that might happen within these walls. "It's perfect," he said honestly. Later, as they prepared to leave, Emma suddenly grabbed Richard's hand. "You'll be here for the opening, right? Promise you won't have an important meeting or something?" The earnestness in her question made Richard kneel to her level. "Emma, there is no meeting more important than being here with you and your grandmother on opening day." Emma studied his face with surprising intensity. "Pinky promise?" She extended her small finger. Richard, who had negotiated multi-billion-dollar deals with nothing more than a handshake, solemnly linked his pinky with hers. Pinky promise. As they drove home, Emma fell asleep in the back seat of the Bentley, her head resting against Charlotte's arm. In the dim light, Charlotte looked more fragile than Richard had ever noticed. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly. "About the doctor?" Charlotte nodded, gently stroking Emma's hair. "I've been so focused on being strong for her that I've neglected taking care of myself. Sarah would scold me for that." "Sarah would understand completely," Richard countered. "But she'd also insist you accept help when offered." When they arrived at Pinewood Gardens, Richard carried the sleeping Emma inside and gently laid her on her bed, while Charlotte removed her shoes. The domestic intimacy of the moment wasn't lost on him. This simple act of caring for a child together created a bond he'd never expected to form. Back in the living room, Charlotte suddenly grasped his arm, her expression serious. "Promise me something, Richard. Anything. If something happens to me, Emma would need someone." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Richard felt the weight of what she was asking. Not just a legal guardianship, but a commitment to love and raise this child who had somehow worked her way into his carefully guarded heart. "She would have me," he said simply. "For as long as she needed." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "Sarah was right about you all along." As Richard left the apartment, he realized with startling clarity that the community center wasn't just about fulfilling a promise to Sarah or even helping children heal from loss. It was about his own healing, a process that had begun the moment he saw a small girl placing flowers on her mother's grave. The morning of the Sarah Blackwood Community Center's grand opening dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight filtering through the changing leaves. Richard arrived an hour early, finding the staff already busy with final preparations. Abigail Chen was arranging art supplies, the newly hired counselors were reviewing their materials, and volunteers placed refreshments on tables adorned with Emma's handmade centerpieces. Richard stood in the main hall taking it all in. The space had transformed from an abandoned warehouse into something warm and welcoming. Children's artwork decorated the walls. Comfortable furniture created cozy nooks for reading or conversation. Natural light streamed through skylights that had been painstakingly installed to his specifications. Sarah would have loved it. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Charlotte's voice came from behind him. She looked better today. The specialist, Richard, had prescribed medication that seemed to be helping with her energy levels. "Better than I imagined," Richard admitted. "Is Emma ready for her big moment?" Charlotte smiled. "She's changed outfits 3 times already. You'd think she was accepting an Oscar instead of cutting a ribbon." As if summoned by her name, Emma burst through the front doors wearing a blue dress with butterflies embroidered on the collar, a gift from Richard for the occasion. "Mr. Richard, do you like my dress? Is it fancy enough? Grandma said I couldn't wear my painting apron even, though that's what real artists wear." Richard crouched to her level, straightening her slightly crooked butterfly hair clip. "You look perfect. Every bit the artist and official ribbon cutter." Emma beamed, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Are there going to be a lot of people? What if I mess up?" "There will be some people, yes, but they're all here because they believe in what we're doing. And you couldn't possibly mess up. It's your center as much as anyone's." Emma considered this, then nodded solemnly. "I practiced cutting paper with the big scissors all week. I'm ready." Within the hour, the center filled with guests, local officials, representatives from children's advocacy groups, potential donors, and most importantly, several families with children who would benefit from the center's services. Richard, who normally detested public speaking that wasn't directly related to business, found himself addressing the crowd with unexpected ease. 10 years ago, my wife Sarah had a vision, a place where children experiencing loss could find community, creative expression, and healing. Today, that vision becomes reality, not because of corporate funding or strategic planning, but because of the inspiration of 2 remarkable people. He gestured toward Charlotte and Emma, who stood nearby. Charlotte Reynolds, whose compassion and wisdom guide everything we do here, and Emma Reynolds, who taught me that sometimes the smallest hands can build the biggest bridges. Emma, standing proudly next to her grandmother, whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear, That's me. I'm the bridge builder. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. After the speeches and the ceremonial ribbon cutting, which Emma executed perfectly, the guests mingled and toured the facility. Richard found himself in conversation with the mayor when Marcus approached, looking uncharacteristically anxious. "Richard, a moment, please." Marcus led him to a quiet corner. Henderson called. "There's a situation with the neural interface. The Japanese team found a critical flaw in the programming. They're saying we'll need to delay the launch by at least 3 months. 3 months ago, this news would have sent Richard into crisis mode. He would have canceled everything, flown to Tokyo immediately, and worked around the clock until the problem was solved. Instead, he found himself nodding calmly. Set up a video conference for tomorrow morning. We'll assess the situation and develop a plan." Marcus looked stunned. "That's it? Just a video call? Richard, this could tank our stock value, or it could prevent a flawed product launch that would cause irreparable damage to our reputation," Richard countered. "Either way, it won't be resolved in the next 4 hours, and I promised a little girl I'd be here for her special day." Marcus walked away, still looking bewildered. Richard noticed Charlotte standing near the entrance, speaking with a mail courier. She accepted a letter, her hands trembling slightly as she read it. Even from across the room, Richard could see the color drain from her face. By the time he reached her side, Charlotte had sunk into a nearby chair, the letter clutched in her hand. "Charlotte? What's wrong?" She looked up, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions: shock, hope, fear. "It's from Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the celebration around them. "My son." Richard recalled their conversations about Charlotte's family. Thomas was Emma's uncle, who had disappeared years ago, struggling with addiction and leaving his sister Jessica to raise Emma alone. "What does he say?" Richard asked gently. "He's been in recovery for 2 years. He says he heard about Jessica's death and—" Her voice broke. "He wants to see Emma, to make amends." Emma appeared at their side, punch cup in hand, immediately sensing something was wrong. "Grandma, are you sad?" Charlotte quickly folded the letter and managed a smile. "No, sweetheart, just surprised. We've received a letter from someone I haven't heard from in a long time." "Who?" Emma asked with a child's direct curiosity. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Richard, silently asking for support. He nodded slightly. "Your Uncle Thomas," Charlotte said carefully. "Your mother's brother, he wants to meet you." Emma's brow furrowed in concentration. "I have an uncle? Like in stories?" "Yes, sweetheart, though I haven't seen him in many years." Emma considered this new information with remarkable composure. "Does he like butterflies too?" Charlotte laughed softly, tears in her eyes. "I don't know, darling, but we might get to find out." As the celebration continued around them, Richard sat with Charlotte and Emma, the letter between them representing yet another unexpected turn in their increasingly intertwined lives. The neural interface crisis seemed distant and unimportant compared to the emotions playing across Charlotte's face. "Whatever you decide about Thomas," Richard said quietly, "you're not alone in this." Charlotte reached out and took his hand, a gesture of trust that meant more to him than any business success ever had. "I know," she replied softly. The community center had emptied of guests, leaving only a few staff members finishing the cleanup. Richard found Charlotte sitting alone in the reading nook, Thomas's letter still in her hands, now creased from repeated folding and unfolding. "Emma's helping Abigail organize the art supplies," Richard said, settling into the chair opposite her. "Apparently visitors completely destroyed her color-coding system." Charlotte's attempt at a smile didn't reach her eyes. That child and her systems. Sometimes I wonder which one of us is really in charge. A comfortable silence fell between them. Through the large windows, the sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the room. Richard waited patiently, giving Charlotte space to gather her thoughts. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about Thomas," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or about Jessica's death." Richard leaned forward slightly, his full attention on Charlotte. "I'm listening." Thomas didn't just have addiction issues, Charlotte began, smoothing the letter on her lap. He got involved with dangerous people. Drug dealers, criminals. When Jessica found out she was pregnant with Emma, she confronted him, tried to help him get clean. Charlotte paused, taking a steadying breath. Thomas didn't respond well. There was a fight. Jessica left and came to live with me. We thought that was the end of it. But Thomas's associates began making threats. They thought Jessica knew things about their operations, their shipments. Richard's expression darkened as he began to understand where this story was heading. The car accident that killed her, Charlotte continued, her voice breaking. The police suspect it wasn't an accident at all. The brake lines had been cut. God, Charlotte, Richard breathed. Why didn't you tell me? What would you have done? Built higher walls around us, hired bodyguards? She shook her head. We'd been safe for over a year. Jessica was just a loose end to them, and once she was gone. She couldn't finish the sentence. And now Thomas wants to see Emma, Richard said, the protective instinct he felt toward the child surprising him with. It's ferocity. Charlotte nodded, handing him the letter. Read it yourself. Richard unfolded the paper, noting the neat, careful handwriting. Dear Mom, I don't know if you'll even open this letter, and I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away. I've been sober for 2 years, 3 months, and 14 days. My sponsor says I need to make amends to those I've hurt, but I know some damage can never be repaired. I heard about Jessica. Words can't express my guilt and grief. Her death is on my hands, even if I didn't physically cut those brake lines. The people I was involved with are gone now, most in prison, some dead. The police detective who investigated Jess's case helped me get into rehab when I finally hit bottom. I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to meet my niece. Not to be part of her life, I haven't earned that. But just to see her once, to apologize, to let her know her mother was the best person I've ever known, and that what happened wasn't Jessica's fault. I'm working as a carpenter now, living clean, in Cedar Ridge. I understand if your answer is no. I'll respect whatever boundaries you set. With love and more regret than I can express, Thomas. Richard read the letter twice, searching for inconsistencies or manipulation, but found only what seemed like genuine remorse. Do you believe him? He asked, returning the letter to Charlotte. I want to, she admitted. He included his sobriety chip in the envelope. 2 years. She pulled out a small bronze medallion. But how can I risk Emma's safety, after everything she's been through? From across the center, they heard Emma's bright laughter as she directed the cleanup efforts with characteristic enthusiasm. She deserves to know her family, Charlotte continued. But I'm afraid, Richard. What if I'm wrong to trust him? Richard considered his response carefully. 10 years ago, his answer would have been simple. Cut all ties, prioritize safety above all else, never risk vulnerability. But Emma had changed something fundamental in him. We could meet him on neutral ground, Richard suggested. Somewhere public, with security present but discreet. Charlotte looked up sharply. We? If you'd like me there, Richard clarified. You and Emma aren't alone in this, Charlotte. The full impact of his words seemed to hit Charlotte all at once. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached across and squeezed his hand. Sarah would be so proud of the man you're becoming, she whispered. Their moment was interrupted by the patter of small feet as Emma ran toward them, clutching a piece of paper. Look what I found when we were cleaning. It was under the visitor book. She thrust a faded photograph into Charlotte's hands. Charlotte gasped softly. The photo showed Jessica, pregnant and smiling, with a younger Thomas beside her. His arm was protectively around his sister's shoulders. Who are they? Emma asked, studying her grandmother's reaction. Charlotte's eyes met Richard's, a silent question passing between them. He nodded encouragingly. This, Charlotte said, pulling Emma gently onto her lap, is your mother, before you were born? She pointed to Jessica's smiling face. And this is your Uncle Thomas, her brother. Emma studied the photograph with intense concentration. My mom was pretty. Yes, Charlotte agreed, her voice thick with emotion. She was beautiful, inside, And out. And my uncle? Emma asked. Is he nice like Mr. Richard? Charlotte hesitated, clearly struggling with how to explain Thomas's complicated history to a 6-year-old. Your uncle made some mistakes. Richard interjected gently. Like all of us do. But he's trying to be better now. Emma seemed to consider. This. Is that why he wrote you a letter, because he's sorry? Charlotte nodded, amazed at Emma's perception. Yes, sweetheart, he wants to meet you. Emma's eyes widened. Me? Really? Then her expression grew serious. Will you and Mr. Richard be there too? We wouldn't let you meet him alone, Richard assured her. We'd all be together. Emma looked back at the photograph, tracing her mother's face with one small finger. I want to meet him, she decided. I can show him my butterflies and tell him about Mom. Charlotte pulled Emma closer, burying her face in her granddaughter's hair for a moment to compose herself. We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see. As night fell completely outside the windows, the four of them remained there. Charlotte, Emma, Richard, and the ghost of Jessica in the photograph, connected by loss, hope, and the tentative formation of something that felt remarkably like family. Later, after driving Charlotte and Emma home, Richard sat in his car outside their apartment building, watching the lights in their windows. His phone buzzed with messages about the neural interface crisis, board members demanding his immediate attention. For the first time in his career, Richard turned his phone off completely and drove home in silence, his mind on a little girl who had asked if her uncle might like butterflies too. 3 months had passed since the community center's opening, and autumn had given way to winter's first tentative embrace. A light dusting of snow covered the garden beds outside the center, where hardy plants selected by Emma and Charlotte still showed touches of green beneath the white powder. Inside, the center hummed with activity. What had begun as a quiet endeavor now served over 30 children regularly, with more joining each week as word spread. The art therapy sessions were particularly popular, with Abigail often needing to schedule additional sessions to accommodate demand. Richard stood in the doorway of the main activity room, watching Emma guide a younger child through the process of creating a paper butterfly. Her patience was remarkable for a 6-year-old, her instructions clear and encouraging. You're doing great, Zach. Now fold it right down the middle, like a taco, remember? The boy, no more than 4 and still struggling with the loss of his father, followed her instructions with intense concentration. When the butterfly took shape, his face lit up with pride. I did it, Emma. Look, it's blue like my dad's favorite color. It's perfect, Emma assured him. Now we can hang it on the memory wall. The memory wall had been Emma's idea, a place where children could display art representing loved ones they'd lost. What had started as a few tentative offerings had grown into a vibrant, colorful tapestry of remembrance and healing. Charlotte approached Richard, clipboard in hand. The board approved the expansion funding, she said, smiling. We can start converting the East Wing after the holidays. Richard nodded, distracted by the scene before him. She's remarkable with them. Emma. Charlotte followed his gaze. Yes. She has a gift for connecting with the other children. They trust her because she understands their loss in a way adults simply can't. The meeting with Thomas had happened 2 weeks after the center opened, a careful, emotional reunion at a local restaurant. Richard had arranged for discreet security, but it proved unnecessary. Thomas was exactly what his letter had suggested, a man carrying immense guilt, seeking not forgiveness, but simply a chance to honor his sister's memory by meeting her daughter. Emma, with the resilience of childhood, had accepted her uncle with surprising ease. He has Mom's smile, she'd observed quietly to Richard afterward. Since then, Thomas had visited twice more, each time bringing a small, thoughtful gift, a handcrafted wooden butterfly box, a children's book about healing. The neural interface crisis had indeed impacted Blackwood Technologies' stock, but Richard's measured, careful approach to the problem had ultimately earned him respect from the board. The product launch was now rescheduled for spring, with improvements that would make it even more groundbreaking. Richard? Charlotte's voice pulled him from his thoughts. The Holiday Program Planning Committee is meeting in 10 minutes. Are you joining us? Wouldn't miss it, he assured her, checking his watch. A simple timepiece that had replaced his ostentatious luxury model. These days, Richard measured time differently, not in profit margins or quarterly reports, but in Emma's milestones, in moments of connection, in small victories at the center. The holiday program was to be the center's first major event since opening. The children would perform songs, display artwork, and share stories of their healing journeys. Parents, donors, and community members would be invited to witness the impact of the center firsthand. In the meeting room, Richard took his seat beside Charlotte at the round table, a deliberate choice to avoid the hierarchy of his corporate boardroom. Emma sat on his other side, officially serving as junior committee member and taking her responsibilities very seriously. "I think we should start with the butterfly song," she announced as the meeting began, "because butterflies are about changing, and that's what we're all doing here." Abigail smiled. "That's a wonderful suggestion, Emma, and perhaps we could display the memory wall creations as an art installation for guests to experience." As the committee discussed logistics, Richard found himself fully engaged. He contributed ideas about lighting, space utilization, and technical considerations with the same focus he once reserved exclusively for billion-dollar deals. After the meeting, as everyone dispersed to their respective tasks, Emma tugged on Richard's sleeve. "Mr. Richard, can you come see something? I made it in art time." She led him to the art room and proudly presented a framed collage. It featured photographs of the center's opening, pressed flowers from the garden, and at its center, a family portrait drawn in Emma's distinctive style. The figures were unmistakable: Charlotte with her silver bun, Emma with her butterfly hair clip, and Richard in what appeared to be his painting clothes, jeans and a button-down with rolled sleeves. "It's for your office," Emma explained. "So, you remember us when you're doing your important business stuff?" Richard crouched to examine the artwork more closely, touched beyond words. "Emma, this is beautiful, but I don't need a reminder to think of you and your grandmother. You're always in my thoughts." Emma beamed, then grew serious. "Grandma says you're like family now, are you?" "Like family?" The question caught Richard off guard, its simplicity belying its profound implications. He considered his response carefully. "I'd like to be," he said finally. "If that's what you and your grandmother want." Emma's response was immediate and definitive. "We do. Grandma smiles more when you're around. And you need us too because you were lonely before." The perceptiveness of her observation struck Richard deeply. He had been lonely, profoundly so. Though, he'd buried that awareness beneath work and achievement. "You're right," he admitted. "I was lonely. Not anymore, though." Emma nodded, satisfied with his answer. "Good, because we're having spaghetti for dinner tonight and Grandma says you're coming over. I'm helping make the sauce." As they walked hand in hand toward the center's entrance where Charlotte waited, Richard realized that somewhere along the way, his carefully structured visits had evolved into something organic and natural. Sunday dinners, weeknight homework help, Saturday mornings in the center's garden. A routine built not around obligation but connection. Outside, the snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting lazily in the winter light. Emma skipped ahead to Charlotte, chattering excitedly about the holiday program plans. Richard watched them, struck by the certainty that this, not the empire he'd built, not the accolades he'd accumulated, was what Sarah had always wanted for him: a family, a purpose, a heart unguarded enough to love again. Richard sat in his office at Blackwood Tower, reviewing the final modifications to the neural interface. The launch was only weeks away, and the improvements had made the technology even more revolutionary than originally designed. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Blackwood, Emma Reynolds is on line 1. She says it's important." Richard smiled, setting aside the technical documents immediately. Emma calling his office was a rare occurrence, permitted only for super important things, according to the system they'd established. "Emma, everything okay?" "Mr. Richard." Her voice bubbled with excitement. "Guess what? I'm going to be Student of the Month." Ms. Wilson is announcing it tomorrow, but she told me today because she knows I'm good at keeping secrets. That's wonderful news, Emma. Congratulations. And there's a special ceremony on Friday afternoon. They give you a certificate and everything. Grandma already asked for time off from the center. She paused. I was wondering if you could come too. The hesitation in her voice made Richard's chest tighten. He quickly checked his calendar. A board meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon, the last major overview before the neural interface launch. I wouldn't miss it, he said, without hesitation. What time? 2:00 in the school auditorium. Her voice lowered conspiratorially. You have to dress nice, but you always do anyway. After ending the call, Richard summoned Marcus to his office. I need the board meeting moved to Thursday. Marcus frowned. The Japanese investors specifically requested Friday. They're flying in just for this. Then we'll start at 9 instead of 2. I have a student of the month ceremony to attend. On Friday, Richard sat between Charlotte and Thomas in the elementary school auditorium, surrounded by proud parents and family members. When Emma's name was called, she walked confidently to the stage, her butterfly clip catching the light. Emma has shown exceptional growth this year, her teacher announced. Her artwork and her kindness to other students make her truly special. As Emma accepted her certificate, she searched the audience until she spotted Richard. The smile that lit her face was worth 1,000 board meetings. Afterward, as Emma showed off her classroom, a teacher's aide approached Richard. You must be Emma's father. She talks about you constantly. Before Richard could correct her, Emma appeared at his side. This is Mr. Richard, she announced proudly. He's my. Emma faltered, looking to Richard with uncertainty. They had never defined their relationship in concrete terms. Richard crouched to Emma's level. I'm family, he said simply, looking into those amber eyes so reminiscent of Sarah's. Emma's face brightened. Yes, he's my family. Later, as they celebrated with ice cream, Richard noticed Charlotte watching him with a thoughtful expression. What? He asked. Nothing, she replied, smiling softly. Just thinking Sarah would be pleased to see you sitting in an elementary school auditorium instead of a boardroom on a Friday afternoon. Richard realized she was right, and more importantly, there was nowhere else he would rather have been. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel glittered with the city's elite. Richard adjusted his bow tie as photographers captured his arrival at the Business Leadership Awards. For the 5th consecutive year, he'd been nominated for CEO of the Year. Across the room, Marcus waved him over to a table where board members and key investors waited. The neural interface had launched 3 weeks ago to unprecedented acclaim, sending Blackwood Technologies stock to record highs. Tonight's your night, Henderson predicted, clapping Richard on the shoulder. The competition doesn't stand a chance. Richard nodded politely, but his thoughts drifted to Emma's science project he'd promised to help with tomorrow. He checked his watch. The ceremony would run late, but he'd still have time to review her presentation before bed. When his category was announced, the room hushed. The presenter listed Richard's accomplishments. The neural interface breakthrough, expanded Asian markets, 30% revenue growth. His victory seemed inevitable, and the award goes to Richard Blackwood, Blackwood Technologies. Applause erupted as Richard approached the podium. Camera flashes illuminated his path. He placed the crystal trophy on the lectern and surveyed the audience, powerful figures who had once been the sole focus of his ambition. Thank you for this honor, he began, deviating from his prepared remarks. 10 years ago, my late wife Sarah told me something I wasn't ready to hear. She said true legacy isn't measured in market share or technological breakthroughs. Richard paused, fingers brushing the award. 6 months ago, I met a little girl placing flowers on her mother's grave. She taught me what Sarah meant about legacy. Through Emma Reynolds, I discovered that our most meaningful achievements are measured in lives touched, not fortunes amassed. The audience shifted uncomfortably at this departure from typical acceptance speech territory. The Sarah Blackwood Community Center has helped over 50 children process grief through art and community. It's small compared to our corporate ventures, but infinitely more valuable. Richard's voice grew stronger. I stand before you tonight not just as a CEO, but as someone learning that success has many definitions. From his pocket, Richard withdrew a small paper butterfly Emma had given him for luck. This means more to me than any award. It represents transformation. What happens when we open ourselves to unexpected connections? Backstage after the ceremony, Henderson approached with a concerned expression. Remarkable speech, Richard, though the board might question whether your focus has shifted. Richard smiled, tucking the butterfly back into his pocket. My focus hasn't shifted, Henderson. It's expanded, and the company is stronger for it. Later, as his driver navigated toward home, Richard received a text from Charlotte with a photo of Emma asleep, science project materials spread around her. The caption read, "Couldn't stay awake. Says to tell you she's proud of your shiny award, but needs you for volcanoes tomorrow. Non-negotiable." Richard smiled, setting the crystal trophy aside on the seat. The recognition that truly mattered waited for him in a small apartment with butterfly decorations and a science project that couldn't wait. Once upon a time, there was a very sad man who forgot how to see with his heart. Emma's voice carried. Across the community center's main hall, where families had gathered for the center's Stories of Healing event. Seated in the front row, Richard watched with pride as Emma confidently stood at the small podium, her illustrated storybook projected on the screen behind her. He worked in a tall building with glass windows, but he never looked outside at the people. Emma continued, flipping to the next page showing her crayon rendering of Blackwood Tower. He was very good at making money and inventing things, but he didn't have any friends or family to share it with. Charlotte sat beside Richard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thomas stood at the back of the room, a video camera in hand, capturing his niece's moment. Then one day, when it was raining, the man met a little girl who was talking to her mommy in heaven. Emma turned the page to show a surprisingly detailed depiction of their cemetery meeting. The girl was sad too, but she still knew how to see with her heart. Richard felt a lump forming in his throat as Emma continued her story, chronicling their journey together through simply worded insights that cut straight to the truth. The audience listened in rapt attention as this 6-year-old distilled complex emotional transformations into a narrative even the youngest children could understand. The man learned that helping others made the sad feelings smaller, Emma explained, showing a vibrant illustration of the community center. And the girl learned that even when people go to heaven, new people can come into your heart if you leave the door open. Abigail Chen, sitting nearby, discreetly passed Richard a tissue. He hadn't even realized he needed one. They made a new family, Emma said, reaching the final page where 3 figures stood hand in hand under a rainbow of butterflies. Not the kind you're born with, but the kind you find when you're brave enough to see with your heart again. Emma closed her book with a solemn nod. The end. The applause was immediate and heartfelt. Parents wiped away tears, children clapped, enthusiastically, and Richard found himself momentarily unable to move, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom in Emma's storytelling. As Emma returned to her seat between Richard and Charlotte, she whispered, "Did I do good?" Richard found his voice at last. "You did amazing, Emma. That was the most beautiful story I've ever heard." "It's our story," she replied matter-of-factly. "I wanted everyone to know it has a happy ending." Later, as families mingled over refreshments, a reporter covering the event for the local newspaper approached Richard. "Mr. Blackwood, I'd like to ask about your involvement with the center. It seems quite a departure from your usual corporate focus." Richard watched Emma across the room, helping younger children create butterfly decorations. "Not a departure," he corrected gently. "An evolution. Sometimes it takes a child to remind us what truly matters." The reporter nodded toward Emma. "And the little girl from the story? She's quite remarkable." Richard smiled, a genuine expression that had become increasingly natural over the months. "Yes, she is. She taught this old businessman how to see with his heart again." Spring had returned to the city, bringing with it renewal that seemed fitting for what Richard now considered the anniversary of his own rebirth. Almost exactly 1 year had passed since he'd encountered Emma in the cemetery, since his carefully ordered world had been beautifully disrupted. The community center garden bloomed with flowers planted by the children, Emma's butterfly garden, taking center stage with its riot of colors designed to attract the delicate creatures. On this particular Sunday morning, Richard knelt in the soil beside Emma, helping her transplant seedlings she had started in the center's small greenhouse. Careful with the roots, Emma instructed seriously. They're like veins. If you break them, the plant can't get its food. Richard followed her expert guidance, amazed at how much knowledge she had absorbed from the gardening program. You're becoming quite the botanist, he observed. Emma considered this new word. Is that like a plant doctor? Something like that. He smiled. Charlotte watched from a nearby bench, her health much improved after months of proper medical care. Beside her sat Thomas, who had become a steady presence in their lives, joining them for Sunday dinners, helping with renovations. At the center, slowly rebuilding his relationship with his mother and establishing one with his niece. Richard, Charlotte called, checking her watch. It's nearly time. He nodded, helping Emma clean her hands with the gardening wipes they kept nearby. Today was significant, the anniversary of Sarah's death, which coincided with their planned visit to the cemetery. For the first time, they would visit both Sarah's grave and Jessica's together. As they gathered their things, a center volunteer approached with a message. A visitor had arrived asking specifically for Richard. Curious, he excused himself and headed to the main entrance. The woman waiting in the lobby was unfamiliar, middle-aged with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. She clutched a large envelope to her chest. Mr. Blackwood, I'm Patricia Winters, Jessica, Reynolds' former roommate. Richard's interest was immediately piqued. Please call me Richard, how can I help you? I've been overseas for the past 2 years, she explained. I only recently learned about Jessica's passing. When I was cleaning out some old storage, I found something I think Emma should have. She opened the envelope and removed a small journal with a butterfly embossed on its cover. Jessica kept this during her pregnancy. She wrote letters to Emma, things she hoped to tell her someday. There are also some photographs I thought the family might want. Richard accepted the journal with careful hands. This is incredibly precious. Thank you for bringing it. Patricia hesitated. There's something else you should know. Jessica mentioned Sarah Blackwood in her journal. Apparently, they formed a connection during Sarah's final days at the hospital. Richard's breath caught. What kind of connection? Jessica was volunteering in the oncology ward when your wife was a patient. According to the journal, they spoke often. Sarah told her about your work, her dreams for the foundation. Patricia smiled softly. Jessica wrote that Sarah made her promise to keep an eye on you after she was gone. The pieces suddenly aligned in Richard's mind, the coincidences that had never truly been coincidences. Jessica had known who he was that day in the cemetery. Perhaps she had even visited Sarah's grave herself, bringing Emma along. Thank you, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. This means more than you can know. When he rejoined the others, now waiting by the car, he carefully presented the journal to Charlotte. A visitor brought this. It's Jessica's, written for Emma. Charlotte's hand trembled as she opened the journal to the first page where Jessica had written, For my daughter Emma, so you'll always know how much you were loved even before you arrived. We should give this to Emma when she's older. Charlotte whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. When she can truly understand it. Richard nodded, then shared what Patricia had told him about the connection between Sarah and Jessica. Thomas listened with wonder, while Charlotte smiled as if confirming something she had long suspected. Sarah always was playing the long game, she said softly. At the cemetery, they visited Jessica's grave first. Emma placed fresh flowers, yellow ones, like tiny suns you can hold in your hand. While Thomas stood quietly beside her, his grief and regret still evident, but now tempered with healing. Then they walked together to Sarah's grave. It was Richard's first visit since that fateful rainy morning a year ago. Emma held his hand tightly as they approached. This is where we first met, Emma said, looking up at him with those remarkable amber eyes. I remember you looked sad and scared, but you still stopped to help me." Richard knelt beside the headstone, tracing Sarah's name with gentle fingers. "I think she sent you to me," he said quietly, "to remind me how to live again." Emma considered, this with solemn gravity. "Maybe my mom and your wife are friends in heaven. Maybe they work together to make us a family." From the mouth of a child, the sentiment felt not only possible but probable. Richard looked at the small group surrounding him. Charlotte with her wisdom and strength, Thomas working toward redemption, and Emma, the unexpected catalyst who had changed everything. "I think you're right," he agreed. As they stood together, in the gentle spring sunshine, Richard felt a sense of completion. The void that had consumed him for 10 years was filled not with achievement or accolades, but with the love of this unlikely family that had formed around him. Later, as they planted memorial flowers at both graves, Emma worked with focused determination, patting the soil firmly around each stem. "Mr. Richard," she said suddenly, looking up at him, "I've been thinking." "About what?" he asked, recognizing the expression that usually preceded one of her profound observations. "Since we're a family now, maybe you could just be Richard instead of Mr. Richard, or—" She hesitated, suddenly shy. "Maybe something else if you want." Richard felt his heart expand in his chest, understanding the significance of what she was asking. He looked to Charlotte, who nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes shining with approval. "I would be honored," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Whatever you decide to call me, I'll always be here for you, Emma. Always." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her planting. But as they gathered their gardening tools to leave, Emma slipped her small hand into his and said just loudly enough for him to hear, "Thank you, Dad." And in that moment, standing between the graves of two women who had shaped his fate in ways he was only beginning to understand, Richard Blackwood finally came home. The end.